I'd like to say thank you to those who have joined. And the intent here is really to have somewhat of a more open discussion about the urban water management plan, and to really ask and answer questions about the urban water management plan. But a few housekeeping rules. This is an open meeting, so people do have the ability to unmute themselves and speak. The chat function is open. Usually that works very, very well. Sometimes that could be taken over by somebody that's not being very helpful or constructive. And so if that happens, we'll end the meeting and reschedule the meeting, but I don't anticipate that'll be an issue tonight. What potentially might be an issue tonight is, again, if people forget to mute themselves, that can cause some disturbances in the presentation. The chat function is a good place to ask questions. We'll try and answer those as we go, but we also will pause after each section that we talk about and have a Q&A. And if you can wait to ask those questions during that period of time, it might be better, because some of the questions that you have might, some of the questions that you might be asking could be answered in an additional slide that's coming up. The other thing too is, if you do want to ask a question, raise your virtual hand, and we'll call on you and we'll get that question and we'll try and get that answer to you right away. With that, let's kick it off. So Griselda, could you move to next slide, please? So just the agenda for tonight, we want to walk through the key sections of the urban water management plan. One of the big things that we do want to talk is about just a high level overview of what the urban water management plan is, what those requirements are. We do want to talk about the city's water system and where the city's water sources come from. We do want to talk about climate, both historical climate and what the forecasted climates look like for Sonoma County, as well as Mendocino County, where a lot of our water storage comes from. Population growth and water use projections, that's a big part of the urban water management plan. We'll talk through those. Water use by sector, so different use types, different sectors of the community, how they use water and how that forecasts out over the next several years. Doing a drought assessment that really looks at the supply of the city's water versus the future demands for the city's water. And then to talk through the high level issues or key points of the city's water shortage contingency plan and recommended stages and actions within those stages. Next slide, please. So just as a high level overview, the urban water management plan is required by water code for agencies that have 3,000 connections or serve more than 3,000 acre feet. So the city of Healdsburg, we serve more than 3,000 connections. So we fall into this category where we are obligated every 5 years to complete an urban water management plan. The penalty for not completing the urban water management plan is really that it limits your access to grants and funding that are provided by the Department of Water Resources. So it's not like there's a monetary fine that comes down to the city for not completing it. It just limits the city's ability to compete for grants and funding related to water infrastructure projects. Components, the major components of it, again, water demand analysis. So really trying to look at what the city's current historical water demands are, and then taking that information and forecasting it out 25 years to see what the city's water demands are going to be over many decades. And then what that baseline per capita use and water use targets should be. Looking at water supply analysis. So how much water supply does the city have currently, and how much water supply does the city need in future years? Again, doing that comparison, supply and demand. This is really the key point of this urban water management plan, is to really look at the city's water supply and demand and forecast that out over several years so that the city can prepare for future years and future water needs. And then also there are drought years, there are dry years where there's going to be shortages or limits on the city's water supply. And so we need to plan for those. And so there's a need to have a water shortage contingency plan and drought planning. And so that's part of the plan as well. And we'll talk through that. And then also to talk about demand management and conservation. And so what can the city do to reduce its demand for water, but also be more efficient in how the city uses the water? That's a component of the plan as well. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of background, the staff, city staff has pulled this plan together. So it's a group of staff. We've been working on this for quite some time. Largely the urban water management plan follows a guideline that's provided by the Department of Water Resources, how to pull together the plan and what those key components of the plan are. But we internally, with our city staff, pulled this plan together. We didn't hire a consultant to do it. And the team is myself. I'm Terry Crowley. I'm the city's utility director. Patrick Foose, who's the city's utility engineering manager. Rob Skates, the water and wastewater operations and superintendent. And then Felicia Smith, utility conservation analyst. And you may know Felicia from a lot of the conservation programs that she's pushing forward this year and in years in the past. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Felicia Smith to start talking about the water system and the climate issues.
Great, thank you. You can go to the next slide, Griselda. I will actually give a quick rundown on our water system and sources. So you're looking at a map that shows our water system in totality. So we have about 320,000 feet of water mains that range from 1.5 to 16 inches. We have 7 finished water reserves, 1 raw water reservoir, and 3 well fields, Gauntlet, Fitch, and Dry Creek. Approximately 80% of the city's water supply comes from the Russian River, which is fed by Lake Mendocino. So we're technically considered part of the upper Russian River, north of Dry Creek. And 20% of our water supply comes from Dry Creek, which is fed by Lake Sonoma. Next slide. So I'm going to run through some of the inputs that went into the urban water management plan that are used for both projections on supply side and demand side. The first is rainfall. The Russian River watershed is extremely dependent on rainfall as our primary and sole source for our drinking water. And so what you're looking at right now is a chart from Ukiah that looks at monthly precipitation, monthly rain, sliced up through different years. And so we took 1911 to 2020 and looked at how much rain we got on average per month. But we also grabbed 10, 20, and 30 recent year increments to try and determine, has the amount of rainfall in Ukiah changed dramatically such that we need to plan accordingly, particularly being mindful of climate change. And what you'll find is it's actually pretty consistent, whether you're looking at 110 years or 30 years. In fact, in the last 30 years, you actually see in some months a little bit more rain. So in Ukiah, it's fairly consistent, about 40 inches per year. And we use Ukiah because our drinking water comes from the Russian River, which is fed by Lake Mendocino. Next slide. This is the same data, but depicted in a different way. And what you'll notice is some years excessive rain, some average, and some far below average. I know for me in dealing with this drought, certainly the 1977 total rain amount kind of stands out to me here. Next slide. One request that we got when we published the draft of this is, could we also include Santa Rosa's data as an additional precipitation data point? And so pulling the information together in the same way, 1910 to 2020. And we do see that in the last 10 and 20 years, in January and February, we see a slight reduction in rainfall, however, fairly consistent in the last 110 years. Next slide. Similar graph that shows year over year precipitation, and kind of what stands out to me here is once again the 1977 drought, but higher peaks and lower valleys and just a little bit more extreme. I mentioned we do lean on and focus on Ukiah's data because that feeds the Upper Russian River. But I think this data point kind of rounds out the whole watershed, and fairly certain that this is something that Sonoma Water, which manages Lake Sonoma and the Lower Russian River, is probably pretty tuned into. Next slide. Okay, so we looked at the historical precipitation, but one really valuable comment that we got is like, okay, so that's been like the last 120 years, but like what's going to happen in the future as it relates to climate change? So we pulled some pretty good data from a tool called CalAdapt, and what it does is takes like really complicated and variable climate modeling and makes it pretty simple, fairly simple to understand. And so the chart that you're looking at to start is historical and future forecasted temperatures in Healdsburg. And the forecasted looks at two different scenarios. That kind of tealish blue is medium emissions. And then it also takes into account the purple line is high emissions. And so you see the lines that go out from 2020 and on is an average. And then that shaded section is variables and kind of the extremes that could happen in either scenario. And so as you can imagine, due to climate change, we're experiencing global warming, and on average, the temperatures will be going up in Healdsburg. At the bottom, they kind of make it even a little bit more simplistic and show our 30-year average was 73.3 degrees. And then different scenarios based on high emissions, medium versus high emissions, could see an increase on average of up to 3.2 to almost 4 degrees, and then kind of shows the range that could exist over 30 years. So this is temperature in Healdsburg. Next slide. Okay, similar style chart, but this is looking at Healdsburg's precipitation. And so you see the historical and then the forecasted 2020 and out. Once again, the shaded area is really showing kind of the extreme scenarios of excessive rainfall or serious dry spells. And so I couldn't help but notice that some of the peaks on the high side exceeded over 100 inches. So I know that we are in the throes of a pretty severe drought right now, but we've also experienced quite a bit of flooding. And so that really stood out to me. At the bottom, we have our historical 1961 to 1990, that shows 41 inches. And the variable that could change depending on emissions is, between 1 and 1.5 inches. But for the sake of consistency, we did want to look at Ukiah. So if we go to the next slide, this is Ukiah's precipitation. And the gist here is they're looking at about 1 inch less in precipitation as compared to Healdsburg. So I know the average line seems like pretty consistent. However, if you look at the 1961 to 1990 historical observed, this is what we can anticipate in the future. And we know because of climate change, we will have higher peaks, lower valleys, meaning excessive rain and prolonged dry spells. So that's kind of what we got out of the CalAdapt information, but I'm a little bit more fine-tuned in looking at the forecasts. Next slide. So this kind of rolls up into the climate change considerations. There are 3 primary that are talked about in the Urban Water Management Plan. The first is supply. And in short, we know that the water supply will be impacted by drought, wildfires, and flooding, all 3 of which we have experienced here in Healdsburg. On the demand side, one thing that we are anticipating and trying to plan for is as temperatures continue to increase, we will have a higher water demand, particularly in the summertime for outdoor irrigation and landscaping. And then the last one is water quality sensitivity, and that can show up in the forms of inconsistent stream flows, potentially algae growth, and abnormal drought year reservoir operations. We are actually sort of confronting this year in that the storage levels of Lake Mendocino are extremely low, and there's some questions about how do the operations work? So something that we're kind of dealing with today. So with that, I'm going to pause and open it up if there are any questions related to historical, forecasted precipitation, and climate change considerations at large. And if you want to raise your hand, or we're a fairly small group, you can just unmute yourself. And if not, I will continue on with population. Okay. All right, the next input, which is informs the demand side projections, is population. And so what you're looking at is a chart that shows historical and projected forecasted population. Since 2011, we've been pretty flat and pretty consistent in our population. However, for the Urban Water Management Plan, we assumed between 2020 and 2030, a 3% increase, and then 1% thereafter. And so the light blue bars is the forecasted population through 2045, which is the period that we observe in the Urban Water Management Plan. Next slide. So one comment that we got when we published the draft was like, how did you pick 3%? Because we've historically been at 1%. So we wanted to kind of fine tune that and share some of the assumptions. We actually thought that we were being pretty conservative in assuming 3%, but we factored in a few things that have changed, particularly affordable housing. And so at the bottom of this slide, you'll see our assumptions. So for a few years, we factor in 30 units of growth management ordinance. We have 20 ADUs, which could be a little bit aggressive, but we also know our RENA numbers per year. And so that last column shows total housing, total dwellings added per year. And we assumed 2.5 people per household. And I apologize, this slide does not have the word people on it on the left. And so when we took these assumptions and we added it into the population, you see the chart on the top. The orange line was our assumption, 3% going to 1%. And the blue actually accounts for all of these assumptions. And we're sort of on the nose with a couple of years being, slightly lower. Next slide. Okay. In order to project future water demands, we had to kind of look backwards and say, what have we historically used? And so this shows historical and forecasted demands here in Healdsburg. You're looking at a bar graph that shows single family residential, which is our largest user. We did carve out multifamily. That was a totally reasonable and understandable request of how much do our multifamily housing use in water. We have industrial, government is our city facilities and parks, and commercial entities. So how much water is each sector using? And then applying the population growth for residential, 3% for the first 10 years, 1% thereafter. Everything else, commercial, government facilities, industrial, all just assumes 1%. And so this kind of gives you the breakdown of where we're headed in terms of water demand. This is a required chart of the Urban Water Management Plan that is not super helpful or very nice to look at, but it shows every 5-year increment what our projected demand is in totality relative to population. And the only thing I would mention on this slide is that it also includes Fitch Mountain. So we are a wholesaler to Fitch Mountain. We provide their water. And in the Urban Water Management Plan, we assume no growth. And so their water usage will remain flat throughout until 2045. Next slide. And then this is a sector-based breakdown on those projections. So how much water are we projecting for single family, multifamily, commercial, et cetera. It also adds a couple of other things. There is a line for landscaping. So this is not our sole landscaping use. However, we have some water meters that are dedicated landscape. So we can track some landscaping usage separate. And once again, we did separate out instead of looking at residential in its entirety, separating out single family homes versus multifamily. Okay, with that, I think we'll go to the next slide. Okay, I will pause for questions on kind of all of the inputs that went into the urban water management plan before turning it over to Patrick to talk about supply. Okay, with that, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat either, so I will turn it over to Patrick Foos.
Thank you, Felicia. I'm, given the broad number of people that we have in the room, I'm tempted to do a mic check. Can everybody hear me? Good evening. So I'd like to talk about the water rights that the city has. Under normal years, we have 4 water rights that we enjoy and a contracted water right. The first water right is at Gauntlet. It's served at the Gauntlet well field through 4 wells that tap into the Russian River source. The Fitch water right is it's a year-round water right that we can use only part of the year because of some turbidity issues. We anticipate that those would be resolved by the addition of a filtration plant, and we're projecting that filtration plant to start coming under design around 2035 and perhaps online for use by 2040. The Dry Creek water right is seasonal, and Terry's got some discussion later on the Dry Creek water right. But right now we can use that from May to the end of October, and so November is not one of the months that we can use it. So it's from May to the beginning of November. The Fitch Mountain water right is a water right when we started serving CSA 41, which provides water, is the water company for those homes. We got access to that water right. And finally, there is some contracted water that we have from Sonoma County Water Agency. And it's a volumetric basis, but essentially it works out to be about 138 million gallons per year. And we can withdraw that water from any of our diversion points. Next slide, please. So under an annualized basis, under a normal year, the water rights look like this. But as I said in the previous slide, that some of those water rights are seasonal or they have seasonal fluctuations. So an annualized basis doesn't tell as good a story as I would hope, but the Urban Water Management Plan asks for annualized data. So this is the annualized data. And as you can see, the water supply is well above what the anticipated demand. So under normal circumstances, there's plenty of water. Next slide, please. The same holds true when we look at it on a month-by-month basis. And we know that we have greater demands in the summertime and less demands in the wintertime, but we also have greater supplies in the summertime and lesser supplies in the wintertime. And under this slide, the anticipated growth is depicted in the lines, and 2020 is depicted in the vertical bars. And you can see that even with the anticipated growth, there's still, under normal circumstances, plenty of water in our water rights available to serve those needs. Next slide, please. However, that can all change, as we are very well aware. We can experience a dry year or perhaps a very dry year. The dry year that we took into account for the urban water management plan is much like the one that we've got now. All of our surface water rights have been curtailed, and we've had to petition the state to get water available for public health and safety purposes. And that works out to be approximately 112 gallons per capita per day, per person per day, for all intents and purposes. And but that includes wholesale and retail uses globbed in with that individual population use. So the what we're experiencing now is a limitation of about 74 gallons per person per day for residential, and the remainder of it is being used for commercial purposes. So as we go through the years, we see that the situation is rather dire. Next slide, please. But the ability to withdraw water from the river is anticipated to remain essentially the same, public health and safety purposes. So next slide, please. And this slide presents what that means in terms of the amount of reduction that we would need to sustain in order to achieve the public health and safety goals. So it runs from roughly 40% reductions in 2020 and 45% reductions in 2045. And that anticipates some of the growth aspects that were discussed previously. So under a single dry year, without any additional water supplies, conservation is required. Next slide, please. Under multiple dry years, the assumption that we had made was a bit different. Rather than all of our surface water rights being curtailed, all of them, we assumed that all of them but our most senior water right would be curtailed. So the most senior water right is over at the Fitch water right. And with a recent change in the diversion point, we can divert from the Fitch well field or the Gauntlet well field. So that water right is potentially available year round if Gauntlet is water right is curtailed or somehow not available. So that this works out to be about 708 million gallons per year. Next slide, please. So pressing the multiple dry years forward, the amount of water available is fairly stagnant. So one of the things that we took into account is the potential for groundwater sources in the urban water management plan. We took a look at, is there groundwater available? Looked at some of the historical data, what would be a reasonable assumption? And we identified that there's 3 potential sites that could sustain it. And based on the some DWR records, potentially 100 gallons a minute per each site. So we're looking at 300 gallons a minute as a sustainable yield from a groundwater source. And that could be available by, say, 2030. And that's what the change is, the bump in the number from 708 million gallons per year to 865. But as you can see, the normal demand, while it's aided by the increase in the water supply, it eventually surpasses it, as the next slide is going to show you. So we do get a bump in the water available. That's the darker line, and the orange line is the demand. And moving forward into the future, there will be a need for continued conservation to stay within the water that's available, even if we do get the groundwater well in place for this multiple dry year circumstance. Next slide, please. So multiple dry year supply. This is a chart that instead of looking at this as a, it looks at it as a gallons per million gallons per day, so we can look at it on a annualized basis rather than on a monthly basis rather than an annualized basis. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the red line is the water supply without the groundwater wells. The dashed line is the water supply, including the groundwater wells, and we would just barely make it under 2020 conditions. And as growth takes place, there are some years where during the summertime, we wouldn't be able to make it. In fact, all of the ones that we've got projected out. So some reductions would be required. And those can range from 20% to 37%, which is a great improvement over the single dry year. Next slide, please. All right, so some of the ideas, concepts that we've got cooking away here for improving our water supply, water demand situation is, as I mentioned, groundwater wells. We're looking at for the potential for aquifer storage in those wells, and that would allow us to increase the water available during those dry times by stashing away water during the winter time and the wetter years to do so. And it also makes the well concept more sustainable in that we reduce the potential to overdraft that aquifer. Recycled water pipeline. We're currently seeking funding for extending a recycled water pipeline to bring water to through the city, primarily to serve municipal turf at the parks, schools, cemetery, the golf course. For the purposes of the urban water management plan, the recycled water is not considered an addition to the supply. It's a reduction in demand. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to reiterate it again. Conservation is the most effective means that we have at our disposal right now to balance the water supply and demand equation. This has to be something that's becomes part of the lexicon here. We know how to do it, and the community has demonstrated this. At this point, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Terry to talk about the Dry Creek water right that might be changing in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Patrick. So we do have a second water right. So we have a current water right on Dry Creek, and that's been established for many years, many decades, but it's a seasonal water right. And so it only provides us access to the water on Dry Creek from April through November. To help operational needs, the city applied for a water right in the mid 1990s, I think around 1997. The state water board has continued to look at that right, but never given a final decision to the city on what that right would either be approved or not approved. And we're continuing to work through that. And we'll continue to work with that water right. Now, we did not include this water right in the water supply for the city of Healdsburg, even though it's probably potentially likely that we would receive this water right within the next 5 to 10 years, the state board willing. One of the reasons that we didn't include it is that in a drought year, this water right would be very likely one of the first rights to be curtailed. And therefore, when we have these water supply issues, in the single dry year or multiple dry years, that's really where our supply constraint is. And this water right, the Dry Creek year-round water right, because of its date of 1997, would be most likely curtailed before we even had access to it during those times of critical supply. Now, certainly there's some value to the city in normal years to have the flexibility to divert water from Dry Creek versus only being able to divert water from the Russian River in the wintertime. And so we'll continue to pursue this water right. But again, for the supply constraints that we're forecasting through this plan, it really doesn't provide a lot of help. And so we didn't include it in this plan as a portion of our supply. Another option for the city would be to negotiate with Sonoma Water for the purchase of additional contract water. And so contract water is basically water that Sonoma Water, formerly called Sonoma Water Agency, stores within Lake Sonoma as well as Lake Mendocino. And it comes with a cost. It's fairly expensive compared to the city's water rights. but it is a supply of water, and we could negotiate for a fee additional water sources, and that would help augment it. Now, we haven't made those negotiations. We don't necessarily have a funding source for this water, and so we didn't include this as well as a supply, but it is an option in future years that we could potentially augment our supply such that in dry years or multiple dry years that we had an additional source of water. But likely it too would also be restricted during those dry years, maybe not fully curtailed, but certainly limited to what the purchased amount would be. Next slide, please. And so again, we'll pause here, and then Patrick and I can answer, or even Felicia can answer questions on this section or any other sections that you had. So just either raise your hands and we'll call on you to ask your question.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to run through while we've got the opportunity. So Christopher had asked, if the demand is outpacing supply and is likely to get worse in the future due to climate change, should we not take steps to decrease rather than increase demand moving forward until we can increase supply? Adding demand without substantial increases seems problematic. Our city is focusing on conservation, but we are still increasing demand. So if we want to tease into that just a little bit, so part of the I guess limitations of the urban water management plan is it's not a policy document. It kind of lays out the picture, and the picture is, as you describe it, is fundamentally accurate. So one of the I guess in the moving forward through time, especially in that single dry year, having water available for public health and safety seems to be consistently available, even with the levels that we're talking about. So so moving forward into the future, the amount of conservation that we're experiencing now to get through this dry spell is similar to the amount of conservation that we would anticipate in the future. Whether or not that's acceptable for the city, and that's something that city council is going to need to entertain, and is beyond the scope of the urban water management plan. The next question comes from Marilyn. Will you proactively study bringing purple pipe into neighborhoods? We did look at it on a cursory level. It's essentially rebuilding the water distribution system. And the water distribution system in 2012 was valued at about $58 million. And there's a significant amount of disruption to the community. However, that could be something that gets put in little by slow. That is something that we can take a look at, and as you describe it, a proactive study. Next one is, why are not all parks, lawns, and school greens on recycled water? Perhaps that's why aren't they on recycled water already? This would help a little, but not solve the lack of supply in dry years. And I agree, it's not going to solve the lack of supply. In fact, the parks have taken a haircut on the water supply, and a lot of their lawns have gone dry as well. And that didn't really help the citizenry very much. So as far as bringing the pipeline into town, that is the project that we're seeking funding for. It's an expensive endeavor, and currently not in our budget. And I'm going to take a pause from the chat questions to answer some and entertain a question from somebody who's had their hand for some time. Ms. Mansell.
Hi, thank you very much for all the work you're doing. I know that you heard from me a few times, some of you, about what's been going on the last few months. So I just want to thank you for your work, and none of this is to be taken personally. I'm just really concerned. So one of the things that I wondered, and I didn't get on till later, but what I'm really concerned about, and I get emotional about it, is if you look at the last slide, there's would and could as language, and I'm really concerned about should. So I don't know if you want to look at that last slide, but I think we need to really look at the plan for the urban water management plan as not so much like what it isn't, but what it could be. And of course, what it should be. And get out of the thinking that because it's not a policy document, that we're just waiting for the 5 people on the city council to be the visionaries for what needs to happen in order to secure our water. So I just wanted to ask if we could possibly view the urban water management plan in a unique way, rather than just what it asks us to do, versus maybe showing some leadership. And, the citizens, I think, have shown a lot of leadership and taken it on themselves to, create ways for their plants to stay alive and their trees to stay alive. And of course, with your help, Patrick, and as our principal engineer and Director Crowley and Felicia Smith, our conservation analyst, we felt your support. But at this point, we're feeling like, I know I hear this and I hear a lot, that while it may not be a policy document, the word that's missing is should. We should be doing more. And so I understand what we have to do. I understand that this is going to be over and the meeting's going to end and we're going to move forward and the state's going to accept this document. But my concern is that we don't have a plan that's long-term. And I'm not asking y'all to figure that out tonight, except I don't know where the vision is. And I don't feel satisfied as I look through the plan to really feel like we've accommodated for climate change, as well as the development that continues to take place. And I'm really concerned about it. I'm not anti-hotels, I'm not anti-development, but if you don't have water, there's no point. So I guess I just want to make sure that you understand. My question is, where's the should? What should we be doing more than just what we have to do at this point for this plan? And how can our city council learn from you as staff members so that they can be visionary rather than just check a box and say, we did a plan and the numbers look good and yeah, the rain's coming and it's all going to be okay next year and the citizens can keep conserving. I just feel like it just is untenable to not ask the should question more than just the would and the could. And I'm just hoping that you see that it's more of a rhetorical question, but I'm really nervous and I appreciate your work, but I sure hope that whoever hears this that's got some power can actually do something other than check a box and say we have a plan, when the plan doesn't account for some really bold leadership from the policymakers. I'm not even asking you, Principal Engineer Fuss, to do all this work. You've been doing amazing work, as has our director, but let's get going on the should and really should do the best we can right now. So I had to say that because, as you know, I've been very active and featured in the news, and I'm not trying to act cool. I'm not running again. I don't want any power. I just want to do a good job, because I do remember the last urban water management plan and I trusted in it. And I just feel stupid that I sat there as a member of the city council and accepted somebody's opinion that it's going to be okay. And I just want to do right. So thank you for looking at the question, where's the would, or excuse me, where's the should in this? What should we be doing? Not what we could or would, but what should we be doing? Thank you for listening. I've been really concerned about this.
So that's a really good question, a really good comment, and I appreciate that. And that's one of the things we do hear about the plan is like, where's the clarity and what the action forward is. And so one of the strongest actions I think forward from this plan is that the city needs to really look at groundwater as a supply source, and that in a couple different ways. It helps the city diversify its water supply. So in drought years, there's not such a significant amount of conservation needed. And that's one project that Patrick is working very hard to move forward. Now we conservatively pushed that out to 2030 in the plan, but if we can get that done sooner, obviously we're going to get that done sooner. But we don't want, with this plan, we don't want to overstate or understate anything in here. So we don't want to overstate the supply, very careful to not overstate the supply. And then we're very careful not to understate the demand, probably to the point that we've overstated demand and potentially understated our ability to increase the supply. But that's a conservative approach, and it really gives the community and the council something to work with and something to think forward with in making these policy decisions that would come from the information that the plan provides. The other thing that I think is really important to include as a should in the plan is that the city and the community really need to look at conservation in every year, not just in dry years, but in the normal years, and really look at how we use water and how we can use that more efficiently. How we use it more efficiently in our landscapes, how we use it more efficiently indoors as well. The city has a lot of ability to gain some efficiencies. We're an older community, older housing, older plumbing fixtures. And so that is a pretty strong should. The city should pursue and make a long-term commitment to conservation. And that will help the demand side. So those are two primary things that if anybody picks up the urban water management plan, we would hope that they would get those two things out of the urban water management plan. And that's what our focus is. It doesn't mean that there's not other things that we're looking at. Certainly the recycled water pipeline is a help. It is a good use of water, and we're looking for that, but it is a funding issue that we're trying to work through. So looks like there's another question in the chat.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was going to ask Patrick to maybe respond to kind of an interesting engineering question about, is there any consideration of tertiary treatment of wastewater to make into potable water? Is that happening? Is there?
Oh, that would be yet another level of treatment. So we would take our tertiary water and make it suitable for direct potable reuse. Essentially, it's introducing reverse osmosis into the system. And this was explored a bit ago when we were looking at how are we going to comply with our seasonal discharge requirement. And one of the hangups that process has is, what do you do with the brine? What do you do with the portion that's left behind? And if you're near an ocean, it's convenient. You put it in the ocean, it's going to go there anyway. Is the ocean going to get any saltier? That's not a situation that we have. Trucking costs, as I've come to learn most acutely lately, can be rather frightful. And so perhaps it's worth another investigation. However, I would caution banking everything on that, because the water that we would send back is water that we've already used. So are we really increasing our supply? I would need to tease into that just a little bit. There's a question about surrounding communities not having to make some severe cutbacks, and indicates that our city has made some bad choices regarding supply. And is there anything, or should we not rectify that? And my observation has been that the people that are upstream of the Dry Creek confluence with the Russian River have had severe curtailments. The people that are downstream of the Russian River Dry Creek confluence have not had to have severe curtailments. And we find ourselves situated upstream of that confluence. I'm not sure what to do with this. Moving the city is a big undertaking. But I honestly don't know if there's anything that we can do to change that. The source water is coming from where the source water comes.
So we have Brigitte Mansell with her hand raised. So I was thinking maybe we'd let her speak, and then if it's okay, we'll move on to the remainder of the slides, and then we'll address any other questions in the chat that we haven't responded to. So Brigitte, you want to unmute?
Yeah, I appreciate the format being a little bit conversational rather than just you get your 3 minutes. So thank you, because part of what happened was when Director Crowley answered my question, I just wanted to clarify a couple points. And one of them is this: as a water agency, and we're responsible for this water agency to work, we are supplying water to residents as well as businesses, and commercial. So my question, I guess, is I just wonder, when we talk about like the future building is going to be superior and we're going to be better because the new buildings are going to be superior and all that, but it feels like that to me, it just doesn't seem sustainable to keep thinking that if we build, we can build ourselves out of this. And I guess I'm just concerned about that as a public perception, that somehow people in our town think that our water system is based on growing, because if we don't grow, then we don't make the money we need to have a water department or something. I don't know. There's this idea that we can grow out of this, or somehow we're going to get better because the buildings at Mill District and the buildings at North Village are going to be superior. Montage is going to do a better job building luxury homes. I don't get how all that computes when you have a finite source. So my question is really just, how do you make sense out of saying over and over that, these buildings being built are superior buildings, when I'm sitting in my home paying property taxes, living in a town I love? And yeah, I'd love to keep doing things to my house, but the bottom line is I'm here and they're not here yet. And I'm just curious about that thinking. I just wanted to make sure you understood that building more does not solve the problem of a finite source of water. And you can't get rid of me. I mean, what are you going to do to me because my house isn't as superior as Mill District? I don't know. I just think that kind of thinking is just challenging for a citizen like myself. So I just want to bring that up. Thank you for listening.
That's a good comment. And, it is true that, new construction standards, new building codes are more efficient. But, doesn't matter how efficient it is, it's not producing more water, right? So you have a valid point there. At some point, the challenge that we have, I think we have two issues we're trying to solve. One, we're trying to solve a water supply issue, and then we're also trying to solve a housing issue. So you saw the RENA numbers, and they're pretty substantial. They're double or three times what the GMO allows for housing. And so the state has really given the city an obligation to build affordable housing. And so we need to find a way to solve, I think, both problems. And that's really the challenge. And that's the conversation that probably happens, is maybe informed by the urban water management plan, but not decided by the urban water management plan. So this document, again, will help us to understand what supply we have available to us and what our future growth potential is and what that demand is going to be. And so how do we accommodate these things? Certainly, we're going to have to become more efficient with our water. We're just going to have to do that. And certainly in dry years, it seems like there's always going to be this need for conservation during a dry year or a prolonged period of dry years. And that's just, I don't know that there's a way that's going to change. Doesn't matter how much water we build or how much water we're trying to access. I think there's still going to be this obligation in a dry year or in several dry years that we're going to need to conserve, and we'll need to prepare for that. As we prepare for climate change, we need to prepare to be able to conserve water during these periods of scarcity. So, but the housing crisis is a crisis. That's something that's outside of this plan, but it is informing what the demand for the future need for Healdsburg is, such that we could take this information and really inform those future policies and those future decisions from the community and the council. So with that, I'd like to move back into the slides. And again, we will pause again after these slides and answer more questions. So the next section is really to talk about the water shortage contingency plan. So we know there's going to be dry years in the future. We're experiencing dry here right now, probably one of the more extreme that we've experienced in history. And so it's important to build a plan of how we're going to approach those dry years and how we're going to find conservation such that we can continue to meet these public health and safety needs, our minimum amount of water needs during these times of scarcity. So our current plan that's part of the city's ordinance is a three-stage plan, and it's referred to as the Water Shortage Emergency Plan. The 2020 Urban Water Management Plan and the guidelines produced by the Department of Water Resources recommends the developing of a 6-stage water shortage contingency plan. And these 6 stages would be consistent with other agencies across the state, such that everybody can measure, equally what those stages mean. The stages, as developed would be compounding. So what's prohibited in stage 2 would carry forward and be prohibited in stage 3. So the stages would progress in needs for conservation and progress in the obligations of things that are not really an appropriate use for water during that level of scarcity. The stages or the conservation levels would be triggered by loss of supply. So as the city has its water rights curtailed, so we talked about the Dry Creek water right being a 1997 water right. So if that was approved, it likely would be the first supply that was lost to the city. As the city loses those supplies of water, the city would walk through these stages and indicate what the appropriate level of conservation would be needed to match the city's supply at that point in time. The contingency plan also requires annual updates to council to provide forecasts of the coming year's water supply. And so this is a new requirement of the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. But I think the intent of the Department of Water Resources, including this in the guidelines and in the requirements, is that there's more of an annual check-in, not such a detailed check-in as its 5-year plan is, but an annual check-in with the council saying, this is what the city's demand is, supply forecast for the year, and this is what the city's forecast for supply. And the intent there is to keep the council and the community informed with what's going on with supply as well as demand. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do with these next series of slides is really walk through the 6 stages and what those might look like for the city of Healdsburg. And so typically stage 1 is a 10% voluntary reduction. That really relies on current ongoing conservation measures and programs that are available to community, and that should be available to community in any year, not just dry years. But it also would ramp up customer education and outreach, really informing people about what the water supply situation is and what they could do to potentially conserve some water. Just low cost actions that they can take on a daily basis just to save water. The next stage would be a 20% mandatory, and this would limit irrigation to 3 times a week. Restaurants would only serve water upon request. It would halt permits for new pools to prevent that filling of pools and that demand on the water. It would repair leaks within 7 days. So requiring people, as they find or identify leaks within their system, that they need to quickly act upon that to conserve that water. It would move all construction activities to using recycled water. So again, the construction development community would start to have to haul water for their dust control and their construction activities. And then hotels and restaurants would need to start educating guests and giving them options on what water conservation measures they can take while they stay at these hotels. And then typical no washing of sidewalks or driveways with potable water. The only exception for washing hardscape would be for, say, a public health need, like an eating area or something that needs to be cleaned for sanitation. Next slide, please. So as we progress through these, you can see stage 3 moves to a 30% mandatory, limits irrigation to 2 times per week, prohibits new plantings. We really want to try and prevent the development of new water demands. So new plantings increase water demands to get those plants established. And so that's something that could be delayed or postponed until a time when the supplies have returned to normal. Washing of cars, unless using recycled water, would be prohibited. So really going to a car wash that does recycling of their car wash water would be appropriate, but washing it in your driveway would not be. Power washing, unless necessary for public health. So again, washing of buildings or hardscapes or other things that aren't necessary for public health reasons, that would be prohibited. And then again, introducing this concept of a residential water budget of 400 cubic feet per month per person, which is roughly about 100 gallons per person per day. And that's a number. 100 gallons per person per day is a pretty generous number. It's actually something that's pretty easy to work within when you start looking at your indoor usage. But since we do have our water supply issues in the summer, we are setting these numbers with some accommodation for there's a need for irrigation. And then for commercial and industrial customers, they would need to reduce to 30% or greater. One of the challenges we have with different businesses, different business types, different industries is it's hard for us to really set an established list of prohibitions. Things that they can do, things that they can't do, because each business is so different. A restaurant from a grocery store to a hardware store, they all use water. They all operate their business in a different way. And so to try and include all of those shoulds and should nots of water use in this ordinance would be difficult. So for commercial and industrial, we're setting this 30% or greater reduction. Then moving into stage 4, a 40% mandatory. This would limit irrigation to 1 time per week, prohibit the irrigation of ornamental lawns. So this is really one of the keys that the city has been able to achieve its conservation level, is the prohibition of irrigating grasses that aren't really used for outdoor activities, soccer fields, softball fields, those types of things. It really has saved a lot of water this summer. And so that would be a tool that as we get into the stage 4, a high level, we would enact that tool again. Another concept that we want to add in here for future years is to really talk about zero system demand increase for new construction. And so as construction moves forward, if they wanted to receive an occupancy permit or temporary occupancy where people would actually move in and start using water, we would require them to either postpone their job or go into the community and find an equivalent amount of conservation such that their project would move forward and have a net zero increase on the city's water demand. And so basically the developer would have to fund conservation, put that conservation in place, and then they could get their occupancy permit. And this is a fairly common concept when you get into these very high levels of conservation needs. And it does tend to address the concerns and issues with building. Again, the residential water budget. So as we move through the stages, the residential water budget would reduce. Stage 4 would go to 74 gallons per person per day. Still enough to allow for a little bit of outdoor irrigation, but again, we're getting tighter to the indoor water usage. And again, commercial industrials would be required to reduce by 40% or greater. So next slide, please. And so now we get into stage 5 and stage 6. These are incredibly aggressive. These are incredible limits on short of supply. And so this would prohibit outdoor irrigation with potable water. Residential water budgets would drop to 200 cubic feet per month or 50 gallons per person per day. And again, commercial industrial would need to reduce by 50% or greater. Stage 6, again, very, very similar, 60% mandatory. Water budgets for residential customers of 40 gallons per person per day. Commercial and industrial reductions of 60% or greater per day. And so we don't want to get to these stages. Really what we want to do is try and proactively work towards increasing the city's supply. So again, talking about the groundwater wells, aquifer storage, and again, talking about ongoing conservation, even in wet or normal years, really working towards building that conservation with our community so that we become very efficient in how we're using our water. Next slide, please. And so now this is the end of the slides. And so we'll pause here and allow people to ask questions and see if we can get caught up with maybe some of the questions that are in the chat.
If you want to ask your question live, feel free to raise your hand. And if I don't see any, I will move to the chat.
I'm sorry, I'm Valerie White. I don't see where I can raise my hand.
That's okay. If you just did it.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Yep. No apologies needed.
Okay, so here's my questions. And of course, I know it's difficult to have specific requirements for commercial and industrial businesses, but they're actually, it's a free ride. It means nothing to say that they're going to reduce their usage by 30 or 40 or 50% if there are no fines. Or, how do we know that if they don't, let's say in this case, maybe in May, they use a certain amount of water, and then in July, August, and September, there's no reduction? How are residents going to know that the city did not fine them? Okay, there's question one. And can you answer that one first? And then I have one other one.
Yeah, so we certainly, the city has, with the ordinance, with the water supply contingency plan, that will become part of the city's ordinance. And so anybody that is a gross violator of the water conservation needs of the city would be fined. And, those fines are, the current administrative fine is about $1,000 per day, but it can include shutting off water.
Yep.
And so I agree that, how would the public know what's going on? One of the things that we have done this year is we've taken the monthly bills and monthly usage by sector, and Felicia has pulled that together and published it on the city's website so that you can go by sector and see who's conserving water and to what percentage they're conserving. And so we currently have, correct me if I'm wrong, Felicia, we have the July usage posted on the city's website. And so you can look at those. And I can't recall what the industrial and commercial reductions are, but I think they are in the range of 40%.
Yeah.
Yes. So
yeah. I mean, but again, that was that was the commercial thing. I guess this would go for residential, commercial, everybody. Some cities just have a surcharge on their bills. If you use more water than you're supposed to use at whatever level, there's a surcharge. It's no, you calling people, let's try to work with them and let's find reasons. There's just a surcharge. Is Healdsburg, are you deciding to do something like that?
So we are currently looking at our water rates. We took a pause on developing the water rates because of COVID, but we'd started a process last winter. And in that process, we had considered, again, this is all subject to council's direction and their decision making. But what we considered is that during years of short supply or years where we had to initiate stages of conservation, that there would be a surcharge on the bill, on the water bill. How that's affected can be done in a number of different ways, but I know that I do recall that Santa Rosa in theirs, they have a surcharge as they increase through these phases, but I'm not sure if there's a minimum amount of water that's afforded to residents before they're initiated a surcharge. It seems like if we're going to enact water budgets that we would allow for that minimum amount of water. And then if you exceed it, there would be some type of surcharge assigned to your bill for that exceedance of that water. But again, that is something that we're looking at, something that we're developing, and will probably come forward to council maybe in November, but it is something we are looking at.
Thank you.
So Christopher has his hand raised. You're on mute. There you go.
Okay. I don't know if you follow Next Door Neighbor in Healdsburg, but there's been a lot of suggestions there about how the city might respond to the water shortage. One of them that was interesting that came up the other day was that possibly a water tax on hotel residents. And one of the reasons I bring this up is that when me and my spouse go somewhere for a weekend and overnight, it is so nice to take a long shower. We have not taken a long shower in Healdsburg probably in years. And I'm sure everyone who comes to the hotels does the same thing. But if the city did that, rather than have that money disappear for other purposes, which many government agencies do, they would have to be dedicated to increasing the water supply. Is that something that's been suggested at all or considered?
So in two different ways, we do get a lot of good suggestions from the community, and we do pay attention to those. And there's two suggestions that have been pushed forward. One is to, at the time of development, charge a higher impact fee to develop water supplies. So basically, if you want to develop your project and you want a 4-inch water meter, here's an additional fee that you would need to pay to help fund a groundwater well or some other type of increase to the city's water supply. That's one of the options. We certainly have heard the option of providing an ongoing tax on the existing hotels or certain businesses, or potentially even a tax on all water customers that would help support conservation. And so those are all ideas. Again, those would be policy decisions from the council on how they want to move forward with that. Something that would be outside the scope of the urban water management plan, but certainly something that needs to be addressed and probably would be more likely addressed through a rate setting process.
The second question I had is, what I did not seem to notice in the plan is a suggestion of curbing growth until water supply is improved. And it seems that that might be, an aspect that could be in the plan. And my impression has been, and I could be wrong, that past city councils, and I'm not faulting our current city council, have been very pro-growth. And with that pro-growth, there has been little attention to adequately supplying the infrastructure for water that is necessary with climate change, and in particular in our city. And I'm curious why that was not included in the plan.
So what we tried to do with the plan is really take the data that we had available as far as growth. So what's the GMO? What are we producing as far as ADUs? And what the RENA numbers are, what the affordable housing numbers are passed to us from the state. And take those numbers and push those forward into the plan to develop a water supply demand. The plan isn't a policy document that would dictate or direct the council to reduce growth or stop growth. It's more of a comparison of numbers. So what's your supply, what's your demand? Now, certainly there probably should be a follow-up conversation with how do we continue to meet affordable housing needs, market rate housing needs, while with our limited water supply. How do we increase our water supply so that we can continue to build affordable housing? But those are all challenges that probably need to be subsequent conversations after the urban water management plan is adopted. So the urban water management plan would be.
Confuses me. What confuses me is I've done many business plans for business in past careers. And you do have recommendations in this plan about conservation, how much water should be conserved at different stages. But there's no recommendation about curbing unnecessary growth. I'm not talking about required or necessary growth until the water supply can be adequately improved. And I think that's a fault in the plan.
Yeah, and I can hear your concerns and I understand your concerns. But again, what we're trying to do is be really meeting the guidelines of the urban water management plan, and really trying to present this picture of, here's what the growth is and here's what the supply is. There's issues in the dry years and there's issues in multiple dry years. And that's something that needs to be given further thought. Certainly, we have recommendations and things we're working towards to increase the supply. Certainly we have a strong recommendation in there that there's a need for conservation, but to go towards state policies and state requirements for affordable housing, that's kind of beyond the scope of this plan.
So my question, so one final question. I wasn't talking about affordable housing that the state can mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So the state guidelines prohibited your agency. By the way, I think you're all doing a great job as best you can under the circumstances. So don't get me wrong. But the state guidelines prohibited you all from putting in a recommendation to curb unnecessary growth, not necessary growth, but unnecessary growth until the water supply could be improved. Because with the growth in hotels, swimming pools, all these things that aren't required, which are very pro-growth, and I'm not against growth. I just want the infrastructure there. I see that nowhere in this plan. And as a resident and a paying taxpayer, I find that a little bit frustrating.
So let me, again, I appreciate your feedback, and, none of this is, we appreciate, Healdsburg's a great community as far as the feedback that is provided to staff. I've worked here for over a decade, and I've always been really impressed with the intelligence and the knowledge, and just the way that people present their ideas in Healdsburg. So I do appreciate all the feedback you're providing. And so let me take that back, that last comment, and see if there's something that would be appropriate, that we feel is appropriate, that we could include into either the staff report with the urban water management plan or in the opening statements in the urban water management plan, some of those recommendations. Again, we do have a guideline from the Department of Water Resources that states what the plan is and what should be included. Is it an exhaustive list of what couldn't be included? I don't think it is, but certainly your concerns that you've raised are not singular, and we hear that. And so let me take that back and see if there's a way that we can make sure that the council is aware of that concern when they see the final draft of the urban water management plan.
Lastly, thank you. I greatly appreciate that.
Okay. So I'm not sure, Ms. Benzel, you have your hand raised?
Okay, thank you, Director Crowley. Yeah, so just the context of this, and I appreciate what you just shared. This has been really challenging. Zoom democracy, we've had little access to our government. We can't meet with people. I mean, you get it. In this crisis, we also have COVID. And so it's been really challenging for all of us to try to get our voices heard. So just thanks for being willing to absorb some of this and listen to it. I don't even know the previous speaker, but he's echoing what I've been saying, which is essentially there is a difference between essential housing and non-essential housing, or essential workers and non-essential workers during COVID. So we do make decisions as a government and as agencies as to what's important and what isn't. And certainly lawns have been determined unimportant, and that makes sense in light of how much water they consume. But I guess my question comes back to just is the city of Healdsburg's water security satisfactory? Are we feeling like we have satisfactory water security? And I think the perception is the issue. And so when you have developments going on, and it's not just north and south of town, we have houses in our neighborhoods being flipped, pools going in. I understand we can only do what we can do, but the bottom line is we're seeing a lot of wealth coming into our community. And so taxing the people, I'm just going to say, why not consider that? Why not consider luxury taxes or taxes somehow so that your job can be easier by getting more engineers to do more of the infrastructure work that needs to take place? In other words, as a citizen, why can't we get more revenue? Why can't we charge for our wastewater that we give to agriculture? Why don't we get more money to fund the very things that you need, which are the infrastructure that will make our water security satisfactory? So just bringing it up again, perception is the issue. I understand residents were goggling down the water, and my flume tells you I'm not. Look it up. I'm down to 31 gallons. I'm so proud of myself, but I'm also getting recycled water for my lawn. Not my lawn. I don't have a lawn, but my yard. But my question is, why don't we, just look at that development piece? Director Crowley, thank you for considering that, because why do we want to grow something if we don't have water security? And I think the last speaker brought that up. So thank you. But perception is the issue for residents, and we're not feeling heard because we feel like things happen on Zoom and they don't happen in a room. So thank you for listening.
Are there any other questions that somebody wants to ask live? Otherwise, I will flip over to the chat for a few remaining questions. Okay, one question that we got was why not require all construction to use recycled water at all times, which I think is a great question. It's a great idea. I think historically, it was a combination of like adequate water supply in order for them to use it for, say, dust control. And there's certainly a level of convenience in that construction companies have access to metered fire hydrants that are fairly close to their projects. Right now, we do have increased vehicle miles traveled of trucks going back and forth from our wastewater treatment plant and our recycled water kiosk. That being said, if and when purple pipe and recycled water is brought into the city, there might be an opportunity to create another kiosk and therefore require that. So just a little bit of background on construction water use. Reading through some additional questions. There was a question about access to water meter data. I'm wondering if Terry, you can talk a little bit about what some of the plans are to bring a customer portal so that people can track their water usage without necessarily making the investment, $150 investment in a flume.
So one of the things we've been working on for several years, and there's been other things that have unfortunately jumped in the way, droughts, floods, fires. But we are working to update the city's billing system. Our utility billing system is an ancient software from the early 2000s, and it's not efficient anymore. And so we're looking to replace that with a more modern software. In doing that, we have the option and the ability to include a customer portal, a more advanced customer portal that would allow you access to both your water usage as well as your electricity usage. And also from that, you have the potential to have alerts. So say you had a leak at your house, it could send you an email saying, hey, we think there's a leak at your house. You need to go around and check it out. Or if there's high water usage for the month, you could set a budget of like, I only want to pay X amount of money for my utility bill. So give me alerts if I'm running over that budget. And so it provides a lot of key indicators, and those indicators can help drive conservation. But just that education of, informing people of what they're using, once they understand what they're using, they can measure that and they can reduce it. And so that's one of the things we're working towards. We're trying to get that project kicked off, working with a larger group, with the IT department of the city, the billing department of the city, as well as the utility department of the city. It's just this summer with the drought, it's just taken up a lot of our time. And so that's been a little bit of stalled, but we do want to move that forward. I'd like to see that done within 18 months. But it is a big project to initiate that wholesale software solution. But it should help provide that information to customers about what they're using, and also provide those metrics on a more frequent basis than just a monthly bill.
We have a question from Valerie White, or a suggestion. Would we be willing to make reports to city council meetings explaining specific actions accomplished to obtain drought resiliency? While we have been doing a drought update at every council meeting, this question kind of prompted me that I could also include some water rebates and conservation information. It's been pretty incredible, the number of toilet rebates that have come in this summer. I'm pretty astonished by how many 20-year-old toilets exist in Healdsburg. They are still out there. And so we're seeing quite a bit of savings in that realm. And I am certain that you will be hearing from Patrick Foose and Director Crowley more on the groundwater well. And so I'm sure there will be a lot more updates to come, but we do provide some updates and we can enhance those at every council meeting.
Thank you. I just don't have a hand to raise, so I'll just jump in here. I was really thinking of what I was really thinking of was a drought resiliency, where those are long-term planning, which are, wells, water storage and aquifer, the recycled water, and that's maybe 10 years down the road. But it seems to me there's been very little action in the past on these plans, and I want to light the fire, not me. I would really like the city council to light the fire under the staff to say, and one way to do it is to make you responsible to report to the citizens what you guys are doing. Like if you send in a request to get money from the state of California somehow, not what you're doing to help us conserve water, but what are you doing to get more water for us? That's it.
No, I agree that those updates would be helpful. And again, part of the urban water management plan is an annual update. I don't think an annual update is often enough. And I think, with the initiative that Patrick has pushed forward with the groundwater, that we'll start to hear more updates on what the city is doing to increase the supply based on groundwater. And then Patrick, I don't know if you want to add anything more about the FEMA brick grant or the groundwater supply wells and aquifer storage that you're working on, the RFP that you've recently received and are evaluating.
Yeah, we entertained some proposals from consultants to help us sort out what we're able to achieve from the groundwater situation. And that work has not yet started. We're anticipating that going before council in October. We did apply for some grant funding from, it's a hazard mitigation, and the hazard is drought. And to make us more resilient in drought. So adding a new supply and making it sustainable by adding aquifer storage and recovery, that's kind of the plan that we're moving forward with.
Well, thank you so much, because it seems to me if the state's requiring cities to have more, more housing, which is needed, that the cities, I wish they would somehow unite and say, okay, Mike McGuire, you send us money to make us drought resilient. We need you. You want us to have more residents, then you send us money to help with our water problems. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, and I agree that there's certainly one of the challenges that we have is the funding. And so working with Mike McGuire, he's been a great partner for the city. He's been a good representative of the city and helped with that. And there are seemingly a lot of FEMA grants. There's also a U.S. Bureau of Reclamation grant that's out there as well that we're looking at. So trying to get the funds for it, and while simultaneously building a plan for what do we do to actually improve that groundwater supply. So with that, I wanted to turn and talk a little bit about the schedule. So we have the draft urban water management plan. One of the key benefits of tonight is that we wanted to hear, again, more feedback, and again, have a better dialogue, a better Q&A back and forth with the Healdsburg community to help us inform the plan. And so we'll take that forward. We're going to incorporate that into the plan, add some of the things that we've talked about through this, the presentation back into the draft version. And then our goal is to bring that draft urban water management plan back before council October 18th. And have council consider it for a final adoption such that we can submit it to the state and meet that compliance requirement. Again, I'll reiterate that we are trying to include all these comments, not the comments just that we've heard in this meeting, but in subsequent meetings and the emails that we hear and other, items that we hear, but that's the intent. And so you'll be able to provide comments certainly at that council meeting. I would encourage the participation there, especially some of the stronger points. I think the council enjoys hearing that. They like to see a community that's engaged. And so that's where we're at. And again, I would just like to thank everybody for showing up tonight and taking, an hour and a half out of their evening to really help inform and plan the city's water supply going forward. So thank you. And if you have questions, we have the conservation email that you can shoot to. If you have more comments that you'd like to supply to us, that conservation email gets to the entire group here. And so that's a really good form to provide additional feedback should you want to do that. Right, so have a good evening and thank you again.
Right.
Good night.